Amara clutched her swollen belly as a sharp contraction gripped her. Her cries echoed through the luxurious mansion, but her husband, Richard, barely flinched. Instead, he stood in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting his silk tie and spraying himself with expensive cologne. Amara could hardly believe what was happening. Her water had broken, and rather than rush her to the hospital, Richard was pacing with irritation, muttering about being late for his appointment. That appointment, Amara knew all too well, was his mistress, Serena. For months, Richard's eyes had wandered, his affections grown cold. Tonight, his betrayal became undeniable. "Richard, please," Amara begged, sweat dripping down her face. "Our baby, he's coming." He turned, his expression sharp and unyielding. "You'll manage," he said flatly. "I have more important matters to attend to." His words pierced deeper than the contractions. The man she had loved and trusted for years, the man who had promised forever, was abandoning her at the most critical moment. He called the driver, not for her, but for himself, leaving her in the driveway. When Amara doubled over in pain, Richard shook his head in annoyance. "Stop being dramatic. Call an ambulance if you must. Serena's waiting for me." With that, he walked away, leaving Amara writhing in labor, tears blurring her vision. In that moment, something inside her broke, not just her water, but her heart. Amara struggled to dial emergency services, her trembling hands barely holding the phone. Before she could finish, a neighbor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Jacobs, spotted her from across the street. Rushing over, Mrs. Jacobs supported Amara's weak frame and shouted for her son, Daniel, to bring the car. Within minutes, Amara was in the back seat, breathing through the unbearable contractions as Daniel sped toward the hospital. Unlike Richard's cold dismissal, Daniel's calm voice and reassuring presence soothed her. "Hold on, ma'am. We'll get you there safely," he promised. Tears streamed down Amara's cheeks, not just from pain, but from gratitude for this unexpected kindness. As they reached the hospital, doctors rushed her to the delivery room. Hours later, Amara heard the cry of her newborn son, the sweetest sound she had ever known. Exhausted but overwhelmed with joy, she whispered, "You're my miracle." Daniel and Mrs. Jacobs waited outside, unwilling to leave her alone. In those fragile hours, strangers became family, while the man who vowed to love her in sickness and health was nowhere to be found. Amara realized that fate sometimes replaces betrayal with blessings in disguise. While Amara fought for her baby's first breath, Richard was sipping champagne with Serena at a private suite downtown. Serena, a younger, glamorous socialite, smirked as she nestled into his arms. "So, is it done?" she purred. Richard nodded smugly. "She's out of the picture now. From today, it's you and me." Serena feigned sympathy. "Poor woman, giving birth all alone." Richard shrugged. "She'll manage. Besides, once the divorce is finalized, I'll have control over everything. She has no career, no family backing her, and no money of her own. She'll crawl back if she wants a dime." They laughed, clinking glasses, blind to the storm that was brewing. Serena's satisfaction was complete. She had not only stolen a man, but she believed she had secured wealth and status. But neither of them knew that Amara's late grandfather had left her a hidden inheritance of $20 million, protected by a trust that would activate on the birth of her first child. Richard thought he had won, but in truth, he had just gambled away the greatest fortune of his life. 2 days after giving birth, Amara received a visit from her family lawyer, Mr. Peters. He was a gray-haired gentleman who had served her late grandfather for decades. Sitting by her hospital bed, he smiled warmly and handed her a sealed envelope. "Your grandfather planned for this day," he said. Amara blinked in confusion. "Planned? What do you mean?" Mr. Peters explained that her grandfather had established a trust fund of $20 million to be released to her upon the birth of her first child. "You are now the sole beneficiary," he concluded. Amara was stunned into silence. For years, Richard had belittled her, claiming she brought nothing into their marriage. He had insisted he was the provider, the owner of everything. Now she realized she had been sitting on more wealth than he ever dreamed of. Tears filled her eyes, not from sorrow, but from relief and newfound strength. She was no longer helpless. She had the power to stand on her own, protect her baby, and walk away from Richard forever. When Richard finally bothered to call, it wasn't to ask about the baby. Instead, he wanted to discuss divorce terms. He arrived at the hospital expecting a broken woman, ready to beg for scraps. Instead, he found Amara sitting upright, her baby cradled in her arms, with Mr. Peters at her side. Richard smirked arrogantly. "Amara, let's not make this messy. Sign the papers, and I'll give you a monthly allowance. Of course, the house and assets remain with me." Before Amara could respond, Mr. Peters slid a folder across the table. "Correction, Mr. Richards. All assets in this marriage will be reviewed in light of Mrs. Amara's inheritance. She is now worth $20 million. You, however, are not entitled to a cent." Richard's face went pale. What? What inheritance? Amara's calm gaze met his. "The inheritance you never cared to ask about. You kicked me out during labor for your mistress, thinking I was powerless. But I was never powerless, Richard. I just didn't know it." For the first time, Richard's arrogance cracked. When Serena heard the news, her confidence crumbled. She had pursued Richard for his wealth, but now his empire was slipping away. Furious, she confronted him in their hotel suite. "You told me she had nothing," she screamed. Richard paced the floor, gripping his hair. "I didn't know, Serena. How could I? She never mentioned anything." Serena's eyes narrowed. "And now what? She's worth $20 million, and you're what? A failed husband with nothing to his name?" Richard tried to calm her, but Serena was already packing her bags. "I'm not sticking around for this. I don't date losers." With those words, she stormed out, leaving Richard to collapse into the chair, haunted by the image of Amara's quiet strength. He had lost his wife, his child, his mistress, and soon everything else. While Richard spiraled, Amara found herself surrounded by unexpected love. Mrs. Jacobs and Daniel visited often, doting on her newborn son, who she named Emmanuel, God is with us. Daniel, in particular, was gentle and attentive, always ready to help with late-night feedings or errands. His quiet admiration grew into affection, though he never pressured Amara. One evening, as the baby slept peacefully, Daniel said softly, "He's lucky to have you as his mother. And I'm honored to be part of your world." Amara's heart stirred. For the first time in months, she felt truly seen and cherished. The betrayal of Richard still stung, but in its place was the blossoming of hope. Richard, desperate to regain control, filed for custody of Emmanuel, claiming Amara was unfit. He argued she had no stable income and relied on strangers for support. But in court, Mr. Peters presented evidence of Amara's inheritance, financial stability, and the testimony of Mrs. Jacobs and Daniel, who confirmed her dedication as a mother. Richard, on the other hand, was exposed for abandoning his wife during labor and living with his mistress. The judge's gavel struck with finality. Full custody awarded to Amara, with Richard granted only supervised visits. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Richard's shoulders slumped in defeat, his eyes hollow. Amara, holding Emmanuel close, walked out with her head held high, a symbol of resilience and justice. With her inheritance, Amara purchased a beautiful estate, not as a trophy, but as a safe haven for her child. Every room was filled with warmth, love, and laughter, a stark contrast to the cold walls of Richard's mansion. She also established a charity in her grandfather's honor, supporting single mothers who had been abandoned, just as she once had. Reporters soon caught wind of her story, portraying her as a symbol of strength and independence. Invitations from business circles and women's organizations poured in, but Amara remained humble. Her focus was on Emmanuel and building a future free of toxic love. Years later, Richard saw Amara again, at a charity gala where she was the guest of honor. She arrived in a sleek gown, radiant and confident, with Daniel by her side, now her husband and Emmanuel's devoted father. The crowd rose in applause as she spoke of resilience, dignity, and the importance of valuing oneself. Richard watched from a corner, a shadow of his former self. His businesses had collapsed, Serena had long abandoned him, and his name was a stain in society. Amara, however, had risen higher than he ever imagined. Their eyes met briefly across the hall. Richard saw no anger, only peace and indifference. That was the final blow. Amara's success, her happiness without him, was the sweetest revenge of all.